Lauren, let me know we're good. All right. Okay, well, good morning, everyone here in person, and also everyone who's joining us online. I want to welcome you to an ITIF event to have a discussion about a new report that we're releasing or have released, calling for a fundamentally new way of looking at climate policy around the world. Our argument is a pretty bold and straightforward one, which is that the current approach that is really dominant in the US and around the world simply will not work. And we need a new approach. So if you want the shorthand of what we're doing, beyond force, which is essentially what we're trying to do, and moving to a realistic pathway that we call P3, price performance parity. And we'll talk about that today. We've got myself, Rob Atkinson, I lead ITIF, and my colleague, longtime colleague, Robin Gaster, who's president of Incumetrics, and the co-author of this report, will present the findings. Then we'll have two panelists to discuss that. So Robin, as I mentioned, president of Incumetrics, a consulting firm. He's been a long-time student of innovation and technology policy. He, from 2004 to 2017, he was a lead researcher of the National Academy study on SBIR. He used to be at the former Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. He'd worked for the European Commission, Deloitte, and many others. He's also a fellow on our ITIF Center for Clean Energy Innovation. Armand Cohen, who is joining us remotely from Boston. Armand is the executive director of the Clean Air Task Force. If you don't know CATF, I encourage you to do so. They're a really, I think, unique environmental organization that's focused on really realistic and practical ways of addressing climate and other air quality problems. Armand and his team have co-led two studies on U.S. energy innovation policy, including 4 principles for energy innovation and climate change. Okay. And then last but not least, my colleague Sam Thernstrom. Sam is the founder and executive director of the Energy Innovation Reform Project. He's a senior fellow at the Center for National Interest. He was, prior to this a while ago, was a senior policy advisor at the Clean Air Task Force. He also was a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Okay. Okay, so let me just start by making an assertion that when the COP meeting later I believe in December, meets, what you'll hear really is a narrative that essentially is this: climate is such an emerging and important crisis, which everybody, I believe, including us on this panel, agrees with. It's so important that that we have to get there very quickly, and the only way to get there is to force clean energy onto a dirty energy system. Absent regulations, subsidies, and exhortation, the idea is we just cannot get to net zero. So what's wrong with that? Well, first of all, before I go into that, there's several schools of force. And what I mean by force is not necessarily the government coming in and telling you can't drive a car anymore, although some places are saying you can't drive an internal combustion engine. But what I'm saying is essentially, or what we're saying is that we're not going to get to these clean energy transitions we have to have, whether it's in our personal lives or whether companies and organizations. We're not going to get there just on its own. We have to subsidize it. We have to force it, or we have to use exhortation. You should not eat meat. You should not drive your car. So there are different schools of force. One is what we would call the radical optimist. This is probably nobody than that. Exemplifies that as Mark Jacobson, Mark is essentially, as you can see, we don't need any miracles. We don't need any new technology. Today's technology can save our climate and clean our air. What he's really saying there, though, in the book, and many other people say this, including the Biden administration, is that we can do this today not only at no additional cost, but at reduced cost. In other words, we can grow our economy if we just transition to clean energy. As you'll see, as we point out in the report, that simply is false. There are a few technologies in a few places that meet that criteria, but we are nowhere near having the technological toolbox we need to address climate without paying more. A second school force are what you could term the place-centric advocates. And this is really what the US is, and frankly, most governments in many states. California wants to solve climate change. And so it's basically said by 2035, no more internal combustion engines. Problem with that is California accounts for very little of the global emissions. To solve climate change, we need a technology system that is usable for the entire world. One of the issues related to that is look at the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. As important as that was, as massive the subsidies are, unless those subsidies drive clean technology evolution and innovation in the US, the only result of the IRA, there'll be two results. One, we'll have a lot more production in the US, which is good. And secondly, we'll reduce somewhat our emissions. But at the end of the day, global warming is global. It doesn't matter what we do in our country for emissions. What matters is what the rest of the world does. A third category are what we call the hair shirters. You're supposed to drive, you're not supposed to drive your car, you're supposed to take metro, you're not supposed to live in the suburbs, you're not supposed to eat meat, you're not supposed to have kids, you're supposed to turn your thermostat down. It's a whole school of things to say that. And why aren't you doing that? What's wrong with you? Well, the reality is very few people are going to do that. Very few people, particularly in India and Africa and other places where what they want, and rightly so, is to escape abject poverty and join the global middle class. And for us to say to them, sorry, the planet can't sustain that. You have to stay poor. That's just not going to fly, nor is it ethical. Another school of force are the Cassandras. Say, civilization's in the balance. And we've been hearing that narrative in the last few weeks with the heat waves. Civilization may be in the balance. I don't know. There's no question climate change is real. No question it's going to have serious effects. But I don't know whether civilization is in the balance. But the narrative is if we don't do something now, the end of the world as we know it. And therefore, we just got to go a lot faster. And so Simon Sharp, a UK advocate, his book is, we just need to go 5 times faster. So, all right, now we're done. Let's just go 5 times faster. Well, how do you do that? Who's going to go 5 times faster? Why are they going to go 5 times faster? And that book never answers those questions. It just, we should go 5 times faster. And when we meet in COPs, in a COP where is it, in UAE, wherever it is.
Yeah, I think it's in the UAE.
The ministers should just commit to 5 times more. Commit to 100 times more really is pretty meaningless because commitments are meaningless until they can be backed up with action, and they haven't been. I put this in there because there was a really good, this isn't in the report, but it was a very good Wall Street Journal article today about the rise of eco-activism and somewhat eco-terrorists. This is the same argument, but rather than go faster, we have to engage in property damage, vandalism, violence, shutting down traffic, throwing soup cans at art. This is a crisis. We've got to take action. I love that book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. This is written by a professor in Sweden who is at a publicly funded university. I can imagine Ingrid going home in December or Thanksgiving, and Dad says, "What are you learning at school, Ingrid?" And she says, "Well, I'm learning how to blow up pipelines." Ah, very interesting. This thing here is a group that has a website, and I think it's something tires. What it encourages you to do, and it has a group in the US, it encourages you to go out and find an SUV and let the air out of all their tires. And they've done this. And we all know that that's going to save the climate, right? The other thing they do is they have a clear statement that says, if you see an SUV with an electric vehicle, an EV SUV, you should let the air out of that too. Doesn't matter what it is, just SUVs are bad because we're not going to, EVs can't save the climate. We just have to stop driving SUVs. So what you see, I just looked this weekend at my news feed, and just to give you an example of what I saw of force, just in one weekend in the news feed. New article saying there were 190 lawsuits filed against carbon polluters. So if you've emitted carbon, you now can have a lawsuit against you. I'm waiting for them to go after me. I ride my bicycle to work, but I have to say I had a Honda Civic 2006. It had 32,000 miles on it before it died. So I've omitted and committed a sin of my 32,000 miles driving over, what was that, 14, 15, 16 years. And I should be sued, taken to court. Let me know when. Another one, G20 energy ministers failed to agree on fossil fuel roadmap. No kidding, they failed to agree because there are many countries in the G20 who will not commit to phasing out fossil fuels. The statement didn't even mention coal because they're building more coal-fired power plants because that's all they can get. Another news article out of Europe said, is your climate anxiety spiking during the heat wave? Well, you can take these small steps. You can make sure that you only invest your pension in green companies, and don't forget, avoid flying wherever you can. Particularly avoid flying your private jet. That's what I want to do. Another one by the head of the UN. He said the climate goals can't be met without investing more in renewables in poor nations. What he meant by that was not investing, subsidizing. Explain to me where the money is going to go for this massive subsidy. Another recent survey, 59% of Germans want a frequent flyer tax. That's because 1% of Germans are frequent flyers. So I would tax those people too. The only problem is I'm a frequent flyer. So I don't really like that. Exactly. 59% want to tax frequent flyers, but only 19% said they would buy an EV. NREL recently did a study. 85% of Americans are willing to pay more for climate change. $1 a month more. Only a third would pay $10 more. So the reality is force won't work. We've got to figure out a way to get to P3. So there's the answer. Of course, local solutions are not enough. We need global solutions. No countries will pay for more expensive green tech. Even the US, a rich country, we will not raise the gas tax in this country. Very unlikely we'll put in place a carbon tax, even though we support it. And lastly, the climate transition is enormously expensive. It costs tens of trillions of dollars. And markets are the only lever that will provide that capital if they can make a return. So let me turn it over to Robin.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to overlap a little bit with what Rob had to say, and then try and find my way onto the realist pathway forward. This is really where it all starts. This is the emissions map for the globe, and you can see that emissions have started to level off for the rich countries.
That's great.
We're making progress. But the poor countries are only getting started. The low-income countries are just getting started. Africa is almost nothing there. South America is almost nothing there. And Asia continues to grow. Why? Because these countries need energy. This is the scale of the transition. Just a few data points to show. We invest a couple of $1 trillion a year in globally in energy. The high estimate from IEA from McKinsey for the total amount of investment needed by 2050 is 275 trillion. It's an enormous, enormous number. It's not a number that governments can really countenance. Not in the poor countries, certainly, and really not in the rich countries. I mean, we've had our shot. We spent the money on the IRA. We're not doing that again. So we face this challenge of an enormous scale and of countries that are constantly demanding more energy. Look, India has a very nice and substantial renewables program. It's great. I'm in favor of it. They also opened a tender 2 months ago for 121 new coal mines. Their energy has to come from somewhere, and it has to come from somewhere that is cost effective. They can't afford the level of subsidies that we offer here. No, we offer $7,500 per EV if it's made in the US and meets another criteria, but nonetheless, $7,500. That's fine. That's 11% of US household income. But it's 270% of Indian household income. They can't do it. And if we understand that the climate change is global, not just in the sense that that we can't fix the climate here, we have to fix the climate everywhere. That's point one. But point two, that means fixing it everywhere. What really, really matters is what happens to climate in China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Malaysia, and the other faster growing low-income countries where they desperately need energy. So, and I think, let me go back there for one thought. I want you to think for a second about those drivers of energy in low-income countries. We have an industrialization. They're all trying to get onto the ladder to middle-class prosperity. They're industrializing in every way that they possibly can. They're urbanizing. We're seeing, especially with climate change affecting traditional agriculture, we're seeing a flood of people moving to the cities. All the fastest growing cities are in low-income countries. All the biggest cities are now in low-income countries, except for Tokyo. Electrification is coming. Modi's India has transformed rural India by electrifying, and that's coming everywhere. So those three drivers mean that these countries need more and more energy, and justifiably so. They don't want to be poor. They want to get onto the ladder of prosperity, and that requires electricity. So we have this huge problem. We have an existing set of emissions, and we can look down the runway and see that those emissions are good, that the demand for energy is going to grow. So, and at the same time, that these countries, none of these countries are in a position to choose green over growth. They won't. They can't. I don't believe, and maybe Rob can correct me or Sam, I don't believe that a single government has ever been elected on a platform of lower growth. I don't think so. And that's in the rich countries and the poor countries. This is a fantasy that we are going to degrowth our way out of anything. Growth is the future, so we have to figure out what to do about it, and we have to figure out how to get there. And realistically, look, I come from the left. I wrote my dissertation on trade unions. I'm not exactly a card-carrying member, but Still, the reality to me is that the only force in the world with enough leverage and enough power to change the world is the market. So the question then is, how do you engage the market effectively? How can you get the market to make the changes that will drive us along the green transition? We need to understand a little bit about technology curves. This is a bit wonkish, but we'll have to do it. As I'm sure most of you know, as technologies are adopted, their cost falls. You get economies of scale, and the unit cost of each item goes down. We've seen this with cars, with TVs, with semiconductors, with wind, with solar. Great. That curve, that declining cost curve, is the promise that we have to follow. Eventually, technologies will be adopted to the extent that they meet the price and performance of existing technologies. Both of those things are important. Price, obviously, because people buy things when they're cheaper. And if they're more expensive, they won't buy them. But performance really matters too. It's not enough to say that we're producing wind energy at a price which is lower than natural gas. That's true in some places at some times. But it's not true all the time. It's not true because wind is variable. Producing energy 8 hours a day is not the same as producing energy 24 hours a day. You need energy 24 hours a day. So we haven't reached price performance parity. We need to get there. We need to get to the place where the green technology is equivalent in all meaningful ways with dirty technology. So you can see that there are some technologies which are already at P3. They're already at where it says 1x on the left, where fossil fuels are. Some technologies are already there. That's great. All we need to do is find ways to remove barriers to their further adoption. But that's not the story for most green technologies. There are important green technologies which may very well be on the path to P3, on the path to true price performance parity. And here, there are plenty of tools in the industrial policy toolkit that governments can use to help. They can help to demonstrate that these programs work. They can help to scale. They can help with standards. They can remove roadblocks that incumbent technologies like to raise, make things more difficult for new technologies. That happens too. So there's plenty of things that governments can do here, and they will need to do them. I'm not a market-first guy. I don't think markets solve everything. I mean, after all, markets are what got us here. So I see a substantial role for government, even on technologies that are on the path, because we need to accelerate them down that path. But there are other technologies that will never get to P3. And in our sort of kitchen sink approach, we're funding them too. I think exhibit A for this is blue hydrogen. Hydrogen made from natural gas plus carbon capture. The traditional way of making hydrogen is to use natural gas or coal gasification. And it's dirty, produces a lot of emissions. So one possible technical way of doing this is to say, okay, we'll capture the emissions. We'll produce it the same way we always did, and we'll capture the emissions and store them or use them. However, this is by definition a technology that will never reach P3. It is the same dirty technology plus an additional expensive step. It's never going to get there. We're going to be subsidizing it forever. To the extent that blue hydrogen hubs and plants are built, we will subsidize them forever because they will never, never reach price performance parity with dirty technology. That's not a path we should be going down. Endless subsidies have other negative consequences. Aside from being expensive, which these will be, they are open-endedly expensive currently. There's no cap. But they also form a barrier to better technologies. If we subsidize blue technology, blue hydrogen significantly enough to compete with dirty hydrogen, the space for green hydrogen made through electrolysis shrinks. So you get a double whammy. You're paying a lot of money to put barriers in the way of better technologies. This is not a smart way to go. There are some, it's kind of weird, sort of final conclusions to draw. It's not that we need to simply let the market go. That's not it at all. But it's also not that we simply throw the money out in every direction, hoping that some of it will stick. A lot of this really is little better than performative. We're just saying we're doing something in order to say we're doing something. I think we can have a smart policy, a smart technology and climate policy that focuses in two directions. Find the technologies that are on the right pathway and give them a boost. Find ways to accelerate them down that curve as fast as possible. And there are barriers. It's always hard for new technologies to get traction. So let's help. But also, when we're faced with technologies like blue hydrogen that will never get there, let's find an alternative. Let's go a different path entirely. I think we're going to be there with aviation fuel. I don't think any of the aviation fuel candidates are going to get to P3. I don't think they're going to come close. So we'll need to find a different solution, maybe through carbon offsets or something like that. But we need to have a really hard look at what we're funding and why we're funding it, and not least how we're funding it, because some of our approaches in terms of program design have not been that smart either. But there is a pathway forward, and it is to fully engage the power of the market. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. I would add one component to that, and that's when you listen to the debate on environmental, a lot of environmental or climate advocates, including scholars, including some at the various institutions that try to measure cost, most of them will have come out with reports that say clean tech is already now price performance competitive with dirty. If you actually read those studies, which I encourage you to do, we've done an analysis on, virtually every one of those studies has two assumptions. One is that we'll continue to subsidize it. So the price that consumers pay will be less, but the cost won't be because it's subsidized. And the second is that they assume, as the old economist joke, you assume a can opener, they assume that the price will fall by half. It's been going like this. So we'll assume it will continue to go like that. And ipso facto, we now are we're below price performance parity. We've got it. And there's no evidence that that's true. And so I think one of the key insights for this report for policymakers is to say, you can't just assume that cost curves go like that. Every single cost curve study, and the Santa Fe Institute has done some really interesting work on polymers, on every single cost curve study goes like that. So the question for every single technology, whether it's silicon-based solar panels, whether it's lithium-ion batteries, whatever it is when you get that cost curve to the flat point, which they all go to, you just can't get more scale. You've learned everything you can learn. Is it above, Robin, can I have the thing? Is it above that? Is it still C or is it B? Everybody in the debate assumes all of these technologies are B technologies. Lithium ion is a B technology. Just look at what Elon Musk did. Silicon solar is a B technology. And the reality is they may be and they may not be. And if we're really going to take climate seriously, we have to assume, first of all, we have to investigate these assertions and assumptions. And secondly, we have to assume that a lot of those won't be. And that means putting way more bets onto earlier and more disruptive technologies. Technologies that may not work, but if they do work, have pretty important, clear ability to get to be the B technologies and not the C technologies. So that really suggests a technology policy oriented approach to climate, not just a subsidy and regulation approach. So with that, Armand, over to you.
Hang on. Great. Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Robin. That was an excellent overview. I am very thrilled by this report. The intellectual clarity is tremendous. I think the P3 framework and the general context and rationale is going to be very, very helpful. Really, unquestionably, there's some almost truisms in the report. Cheap means a lighter lift than expensive. I think we know that that's really common sense. Driving costs down is a big part of the equation. I also want to highlight the point about the developing world versus the rich world and the overall investment required and why we have to be so economical in our industrial policy. Let me give you another set of numbers, which I find interesting on that. So McKinsey and others are saying the energy transition is 4.5 trillion incremental dollars every year between now and 2050. Some people may say, oh, well, that's only 4.5 trillion on $100 trillion global GDP, so that's only 4.5%. That's not a problem. But if you look at a different denominator to compare that 4.5 trillion against, which would be total net global capital formation, that's in the range of 8 to 10 trillion a year. So that's everything we spend on hospitals and computers and desks and whatnot. And industrial equipment. So in a sense, we're saying, well, we're going to take half of global net capital formation and dedicate it to the energy transition, maybe. But I think the minimum message that one should take away from those numbers is that we're going to have to be very, very careful about how we spend money because the political tolerance in the global north and the global south for that level of investment is going to be quite limited, as I think the report points out quite well. I love the framework, extremely helpful. My comments are probably more nuances and qualifications, clarifications perhaps, that we can go back and forth on in discussion. The first point is that performance parity is a very interesting, and price and performance parity is a very interesting framework, but I think it's a little more complicated than just head-to-head commodity comparisons. And I think the report makes this point. But for example, a clear case is that it would be misleading, say, to compare the commodity wind and solar energy production costs today to the costs of clean, firm, dispatchable power like nuclear or gas CCS or geothermal, kind of in the abstract. Even Lazard, with the investment bank that does these levelized cost of energy calculations each year, came out this year with something they call levelized cost of energy plus, which recognizes the system impacts of weather-dependent resources. So solar and wind start getting the adders for the additional backup capacity and storage and so forth, and the numbers double in terms of roughly speaking, or sometimes triple in terms of the actual cost of these weather-dependent technologies. So that's true, but there's the flip side to looking at performance and price parity in a system context, and that is that things like wind and solar, or even I would say green or blue hydrogen, might not look to be competitive or on track to fossil fuel parity if you view them in isolation. But if you look at the role that they might play in a decarbonized energy system, they actually might lower the total cost of achieving the result. So, for example, in the case of solar and wind, they may not make sense, on 100%, like Jacobson argued, is 100% wind and solar will be cheaper and so forth, ignoring effectively the costs of maintaining reliability on the system. But in some moderate contribution, solar and wind, even though they're not at true performance parity in terms of firmness, might still have a net value to the lowering costs in the system by displacing more expensive fuel. And unfortunately, you have to go through kind of a systems analysis to determine whether that's true or not. But I think the report it doesn't really distinguish between system costs and what I would call every tub on its own bottom kind of commodity costs. So that's kind of a maybe a wonky point, but I think it's actually kind of important as we think about whether we're on track B or track C. Similarly, I could argue for hydrogen generation, for load balancing. Clearly, it's an expensive fuel. Whether it's green or blue, it's going to be expensive. But again, if it runs only for a few hundred hours a year and it enables more inexpensive variable generation, arguably it helps meet the P3 requirement for the system overall. So anyway, that's a kind of a qualification on what does P3 really mean. Are we talking about systems or are we talking about individual technologies? And I think that's an important complication. I could even argue on blue hydrogen that there's a kind of evolving pathway here by which blue hydrogen might be initially more expensive and as Robin argues correctly, I think irreducibly more expensive than gray hydrogen. Nonetheless, it could be an early lubricant for creating demand, creating the volumes that we need to support whatever amount of hydrogen we need, which then ultimately fades into another technology. So I think there are time dimensions to the price performance parity as well as this kind of systems analysis. And I apologize if that's a little bit abstract, and maybe we can clarify some of that in the Q&A, but I think it's important what level of analysis we're talking about. Second point that I think the report agrees with, but I'll just draw it out, is that there are interesting regional dynamics. We talked about the global north, the global south. If the global north has limited tolerance for expenditures that increase energy prices, the global south has even less tolerance. That's true. Now, the question, a nuanced question for industrial policy from a global perspective is there may be a role that the global north plays in taking some of the early adoption, some of the early investments, the early industrial policy that drives costs down for populations that can quote unquote afford it. And the trickle down effect into the global south is something to think about. So for example, with PV and wind, Germany and the US took the first losses with subsidies, feed-in tariffs, our renewable portfolio standards. The volume drove those prices down. Now those were crazy expensive investments for the first decade, but ultimately the cost curves did kick in. We got lowered prices. That has enabled the developing world to be fast followers. So I think there's also, in addition to system dynamics and time dynamics, there's also kind of a global diffusion dynamic. And I certainly agree with the premise of the report that unless the subsidies in the global north or regulation or whatever we do is ultimately results in lower costs or affordable costs, whatever those are, we don't have much chance of solving the global climate challenge. Third point, the report seems a little bit ambivalent sometimes about what I'll call technology forcing regulation. The one quote from the report is, "There's no evidence that forcing change with regulation, subsidies, or exhortation will work, and there's plenty of evidence that it won't." I think later the report clarifies that statement and says, well, we won't subsidize, regulate, or exhort our way to parity, but there will be important roles for regulation and subsidies. And so I think it's important that the report not be misread as sort of regulation never matters. There actually is a substantial body of evidence that regulation can, in appropriate circumstances and certainly historically, can drive innovation. There's some very important papers by Margaret Taylor and Ed Rubin at Carnegie Mellon on the history of sulfur scrubbers and NOx controls that suggest that even the threat of regulation sometimes can spur R&D activity, early demonstration, and drive things closer to a performance and cost parity. I think the experience with renewable portfolio standards and feed-in tariffs that I just mentioned are an example. Even in the nuclear case, early subsidies for nuclear in France, Canada, South Korea, big national nuclear programs, in those cases at least, drove down costs over time through volume and learning by doing. This is currently a very hot issue with 111D, so-called, which is the part of the Clean Air Act, which EPA recently issued a proposed rule that would apply a CO2 ratchet for existing gas plants. Again, the opponents of that rule say this is, this will never fly. The 111D in this case is pegged ultimately to a carbon capture and storage standard, emission standard. So some say, well, that's ridiculous. Carbon capture isn't really commercially widespread yet. The counter argument is a technology force argument, as with SO2 and NOx, that regulation and even the ratchet will actually spur, along with the subsidies that are available now under the IRA, will spur a cost decline on carbon capture and storage and make that a viable option. The rule is more complicated than that, but I think this recognition that regulation can have a place, often in conjunction with subsidies or other industrial policies. That's not to say that we should be profligate or indiscriminate about that. I think the argument that Robin makes that we need to be very careful about when and where we apply these tools is really critical. Final question or final point is, and this may be a little bit of an asterisk on the report, and I think the report actually itself acknowledges this. There may be cases where we just will never get to fossil fuel parity. In fact, it's even a category mistake, because things like carbon dioxide removal or carbon capture and storage, in some cases, we're not really competing against fossil fuels. They're just basically pollution control technologies. And again, the world will debate how much pollution control we want to do for carbon, but there is evidence that countries are willing to pay some above parity price, as the acid rain rules, the ozone rules. We see pollution controls on coal plants in the developing world. There is a point at which you may not be able to always meet the P3 standard. Robin uses the example of blue hydrogen. I would say back-end controls or carbon removal might be an example of where to solve the climate problem, whatever that means, I would say managing the climate problem, we may not actually need to say there just are some things we're going to do that aren't P3. Anyway, those are maybe quibbles around the edges or clarifications. I think one of the challenges of this report is that there are a lot of nuances in what it means to do P3. And, I think that unfortunately political economy often takes over. A policy is introduced, a subsidy, and it's just very hard to get rid of. And I think that I don't have a grand answer for that, because industrial policy tends to be very lumpy, very politically driven, and very sticky. So I think one of the grand challenges is, how do we apply these tools surgically, more like a scalpel than like a sledgehammer, which is what we sort of historically do. So anyway, consider those to be more qualifications or questions more than a quibble or a belief that the report is off track. I think the report's quite on track and provides a very valuable set of guideposts for good industrial policy on climate. But I think some of those nuances are equally important to recognize. So thanks for hearing me out.
Armand, super helpful. Thank you for those helpful suggestions. I feel like we should have sent you the report before we published it, but that was our oversight. So thank you, and look forward to the conversation. Sam.
Sure, and if it's all right, maybe I'll just speak from here. It's just a little easier for me to read my notes since my eyes are not great. So thank you for being here, and to the many folks who I know are dialed in. I would say as I start that I think Rob probably put this panel together thinking he would hear very different perspectives from our friend on the left, Armand, and myself representing the right perspective. But actually, a lot of what I have to say is quite consistent with Armand's take on this. I think this is a terrific report. It's got a lot of value to it. There's a lot that I like in it. While Armand's remarks focused on the need to appreciate the nuances in this space, which I would agree with, I would just maybe slightly reframe that in my own terms, which is to fully appreciate the deep uncertainties in this space. And this is something that Robin and I were talking about a little bit as we got started. I'm really with you on the way you're thinking about this with the whole P3 framing. I just think it's really, really, really hard to do. And I don't think the report has yet laid out how to do that, but I know that those questions are very much on your mind, and the report indicates that this is the first of, I hope, a number of reports that will explore this. And so perhaps my concerns today can be fully addressed as you keep rolling on.
One hopes.
One hopes, yes. So I would say, the report touts in many places the need for a realist perspective on climate, and I would very much applaud that. That's something my colleague Paul Saunders, who's here in the audience, Paul and I have been talking about, the need for realism. Am I on? I thought I was on.
There you go. Now you are.
I'm sorry. Everyone on the web didn't hear me. I turned myself off when I thought I was turning myself on. There's a metaphor or something in life there. I apologize. I didn't say anything important to those who missed it. Okay, so I applaud, as I was saying, I applaud the realist perspective on this. I think it's extremely important. At the same time, I do think that it's important to bring a can-do attitude towards this issue, because I think, for me personally, the distance between realism and despair on a daily basis is small and sometimes narrowing. And if we just say, well, this climate problem is hopeless, what are we going to do? China, India, it's all beyond our control, then it's hard for me to get out of bed in the morning. And so I would say I think it's important to believe that demonstrating that the energy transition can happen in an advanced industrial economy in a practical, cost-effective way is the prerequisite for hoping that we could have a global energy transition in a cost-effective way. I think Armin touted, the value of Germany's solar experience. I think there's maybe a point to that, but I would also kind of make the opposite point, which is I think in general, the energy agenda has given us a stark example of how we should not attempt the energy transition. And the question is, can a country like the United States perhaps provide a positive example of how to do it? Doing it in a way that maybe isn't 100% perfect and on the mark and dissimilar from the German approach, but I hope would be distinctly different. And I hope in many ways informed by this quest for P3. I think the framing of the need for P3 is very important, is very correct as far as it goes. It's a long-standing truth that is, I think, often ignored in this space. I do think it's telling that the Mark Jacobsons of the world claim that their technologies meet that standard. They are acknowledging the truth of the need to meet that standard. They're not challenging it, and I think that is striking. And obviously I agree with everyone who points out that the system costs of unreliable, of intermittent renewable technologies need to be reflected when we talk about P3. But at the same time, I think Armin made the point as well. You can't just say that solar and wind don't meet P3, so there's no value to them, right? At the right level of penetration in the market, the right level of contribution to the energy system, in the right resource location, where the wind is good, where the solar is good. Obviously, solar and wind can contribute to lowering system costs. And I've been having this conversation with friends of mine who are renewable advocates for many years. Their line has always been, ask me to do 50% of a system load, no problem. Ask me to do 100%, you're setting renewables up for failure. And so it's getting these questions right in the policy balance is critical. And it doesn't depend upon a simple, this technology hit P3 and that one didn't. And so I just, this is again consistent with Armin's remarks about the nuances, but I would also emphasize the uncertainties in that equation. It's just really hard to know what's going to hit P3 and what isn't. And I'll come back to that if time permits. I also want to emphasize, I think this question, the focus on global solutions and the growth imperative that is in the report is very important. And again, I think is often underappreciated in the public dialogue. So it's well worth, emphasizing that. And the combination of those 2 points, the P3 framing plus the global solutions, brings Robin to the metric that we should not be focused on reducing US emissions per se. We should ask ourselves, are these policies going to help us achieve P3? And that's a somewhat different framing, and I think that's very helpful, very important. But again, I think as Armand stole my thunder a little bit on this, we have to have an example of how we do this. We can't expect China and India to go out and do it on their own if we don't at least show them that it can be done. I don't know if we need to get to the zero emissions economy before we can expect them to do anything, but we need to show them that there's a pathway there, that there are technologies that can be exported, that can be used. And so I do think, again, talking about the difference between realism and despair, the maybe small difference, we got to hope that there's a way to do this right. I do, in terms of my critiques of the report, I do want to pick on the same line that Armand focused on, which is a pretty bold claim, my friend here. There is no evidence, we hear, no evidence that forcing change with regulations, subsidies, or exhortation will work, and there is plenty of evidence that it won't. Now, I agree with that. Obviously, as the broad claim of have we gotten to zero? Of course not, no. But I don't think we can say that there is no evidence. Just this morning, I'm reading in today's clips, DOE is moving forward with finalizing the regulations to phase out the incandescent light bulb. I think that little example gives us a good thing to think about, both in terms of how force can drive innovation and change, and also how the performance word in P3 is a very complicated one. The report talks about performance mostly in terms of dispatchability, reliability, things like that. Those are what you cite specifically, but I think you would probably also acknowledge performance reflects all kinds of social and political values that people have. Yeah. And so we pay a little more, or actually a fair bit more, for our LED light bulbs up front, but they last a lot longer. Some people don't like the quality of the light, others do. The performance cuts in many dimensions. And so I think we do have many examples historically of forcing regulations and subsidies that have encouraged innovation. Do I think that the world collectively is going to pay a high price premium for decarbonization? No, I don't. I think all the realism that the report offers on that front is very important, very valuable. But again, you got to find some way to move forward. And the question of what is P3 and what is the pathway to P3 and how do we know whether we're on it or not is very hard. So I would highlight as a couple of examples, and again, Robin and I were talking about this beforehand. The P3 argument, physics says we'll never get there, has been used against technologies that I have been very bullish on in the past and I'm still hopeful for now, such as carbon capture. Heard that just the physics doesn't work. Well, actually, I think it's more complicated than that. I hear that argument against advanced nuclear, which I'm still very bullish on. You look at, say, Vogtle, for example, right? The Vogtle reactor, they're trying to turn it on now. They're having hiccups. If they ever get it turned on, which I assume they will, it'll be some of the most expensive new power built in this country in a long time, maybe ever, right? I don't know that for a fact, but I think it'd be right up there. Is that the most important thing about Vogtle? That is the most important, most expensive power we've ever built? Or is it more important that it's the first new, somewhat advanced reactor we've built in a long time? We're building up our supply chain. We're acquiring all kinds of understanding of how we do things, professional, commercial expertise. Is that a key step on the road to the great nuclear renaissance or not? I see Robin looking at me with skepticism, and maybe that's fair. Maybe Vogtle is a total boondoggle. My whole point is I just don't know. I don't actually know, and I think it's very hard for us socially to actually know these things for sure in advance. So that's the real challenge. I'm pretty sure if you ask Jigar Shah over at DOE in the loan office, is he working to get these technologies to P3? He'll say absolutely. If you ask his colleagues down at DOE who are administering, tax credit programs for carbon capture, advanced nuclear renewables, they'll all say They're trying to get these technologies to P3. Sunshot, designed to get to P3. I'm not saying these are perfect programs. And again, this speaks to the kind of nuances that Armin is asking us to consider. I'm saying that this report, in an effort to talk about this stuff in a way that we can all talk about, is inherently very simplifying. You're trying to make thematic arguments, and I agree with a lot of the themes, but I also think what we care about here in public policy is execution. We are criticizing the execution of our friends in government. And I think that's perfectly fair. I think the quality of work that we have in government these days is extremely poor. I think the lack of transparency involved in everything from how we set up the hydrogen hubs to how the Inflation Reduction Act was drafted, the lack of transparency is appalling. And we would have much better public policy if we had a collective effort of the NGOs and policymakers and the national academies and so forth to do the kind of analysis that is being called for here. I don't think, though, the simple argument that, we are ignoring P3 now and there's a clear path to P3 that we can get to if only we thought about it, I don't quite think that holds up. I think people think they are trying to get to P3 and they don't know how to make the distinctions. And so that's what I hope will be taken up as we move forward, is how do we distinguish between those things? And the hydrogen example, which has been discussed some already, I think is a great example. I tend to agree with everything that Robin says about hydrogen, but the fact that we have tremendous enthusiasm for it in many quarters, and some people would argue that, as Armin made the argument that maybe there is a path for blue hydrogen. I think he might be wrong, but the point is, when we discuss these things, it's just not crystal clear how you make that determination. So I think that is my main point here. Is I love the P3 framing, but I think we really need to continue to work on how you get to P3, how you know you're getting to P3, how you know you're not getting to P3. And I would offer as an example, some of the things that people have talked about in the past as being some of the biggest government boondoggles in this space that we, failed to cut off research that we should have cut off long before we did, such as the program to, on breeder reactors, for example, held up as a widely direct. Well, we might still want to close the fuel cycle in this country. I think we probably do. And when we get to that day, those billions of dollars that were wasted back then, they might turn out to be useful. I can see Rob is dying to jump in. So
All right.
fire away.
Thank you. I certainly have some reactions. Robin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So
Microphone.
It's on. I completely agree with you about uncertainty and difficulty. One of our tasks here will be to try and figure out what a methodology for distinguishing curve B and curve C technologies might be. It's not easy. I agree. It needs to be rooted in case studies that go pretty deep. I would say there is a lot of work out there, which in Rob's words assumes the can opener, that it works backward from getting to P3 and says, well, this is what P3 looks like. What would the curve look like if we were on that curve? But it doesn't tell you anything about whether it's a real forecast. It's not a forecast. It's some kind of modeling exercise on what you would do to work backwards. So
I agree.
I would agree with that. I mean, I basically agree with your point completely. And I also agree with Armin's point about systems, that it's a complicated business, but I don't really think that, I think that also is a complicated business, but I don't think that in general, the systems approach is actually very widespread. I think, do we really have a firm understanding of where blue hydrogen is supposed to fit in the energy system of the future of the next 12 years? And I think we have no clue. And that's probably, yes, you say hydrogen could be used for decarbonizing difficult to decarbonize sectors. Yes, it could. It could possibly be an energy storage medium in some areas at some times. But we don't really have a systems approach to this. And so I agree with the need. I would love to have a system into which to fit this analysis, but I don't. And I'm going to
Amen.
leave it
All
to
of
Rob to argue about the importance of regulation.
So first of all, I appreciate Armand and Sam, your comments, super helpful. I will say though, that there really isn't any conflict in the report. What the first part I think you're citing was there is no evidence that force will work overall. Then we go into a bunch of examples where if we can, I guess we can't go back, but if you remember that curve, there's that curve where it can get there. And there we say very clearly, if that's the technology you're on, force is actually a good way, whether it's a mandate, whether it's a subsidy, whether it's government procurement. We say that very clearly.
Right. You talk about the need for scaling up
Yeah.
and deployment as a
Right.
critical innovation element, and the role of government as enabling all of those things.
So that's force, if
Right.
you want to use it as
Right.
a broad term. So
Right.
we agree with that, Armand, we agree with that. And Sam, the problem though, is that the narrative in the debate is every technology is on that curve. And we're saying no. And the second thing we're saying is, yeah, we would like to do more. When we can only do so much, we have a first work. We would like to do more work on what kinds of methodologies could governments adopt. But look, at the end of the day, that's their job. I mean, they should be sophisticated enough to start doing this analysis. Sam laughs.
I am laughing. I'm sorry.
But the fact is they don't even do that. I mean, if you look at the tax credit policy for wind and solar, it's, hey, build more wind and solar, we'll give you a tax credit. Why isn't the tax credit designed towards progress towards P3? It's not. Armand and Sam, you both also made this point about, that there are benefits of displacing more expensive parts when you look at the system and you get to 20, 40%. Of course, we don't deny that. 20 to 40% is not going to solve climate change. It helps. To get to solving climate change, you got to get to close to 100%. And what we don't have today are the technologies that will let us do that. So we're not saying, my God, why are these utilities so stupid? Why are they deploying wind and solar? They're not stupid. They're sure deploy wind and solar. It's just not going to, it gets more expensive because you need all these other factors to get to 95%. Sam, Armand, you made this point that when the North adopts, it can drive down costs. Again, same point I just made. Absolutely true. There are some cases where the North is going to be the one that pays the price. We've got the extra money. And if we can identify a technology that we think is on that curve, and the price now is 2x, but if we get scale of 10x, we bring the price down to P3. The rich countries in the North should do that. That is our responsibility. Our only point, again, is a lot of those technologies may not get there. So, Armand, you mentioned NOx and SOx and all that, and it's an important point because very first scholarly article I ever published when I was getting my PhD was on the role of automobile regulations in driving innovation in the car industry. No question that those regulations had important innovation effects. But the reason why we did that, and the reason why we had NOx and sulfur and all those other things, is because NOx and sulfur are not global pollutants. They're national pollutants. So as a country, we're saying, we're willing to pay more for this. The rational decision in a prisoner's dilemma game is to just a free ride, let everybody else pay. That's because when we emit CO2, we're not suffering. The globe is suffering. So I think you can't use that same analogy of pollution control because pollution was in our system. I think, the other component here, Sam, you mentioned nuclear and Vogtle, which I don't know what that is, but it's some
New Southern company.
Yeah,
in Georgia.
right.
In Georgia.
That is exactly what we're saying. We should be taking bigger risks, more risks, not just saying, oh, we've got we've got lithium ion. Let's just go the heck to town on lithium ion. We've got regular nuclear. No, I think we should be thinking, you mentioned realism versus despair. I think we should be embracing exuberance. No, I'm quite serious. Why can't we develop a global energy system that is half the price and 100% clean? Why can't we have that as a goal? And think about the radical breakthroughs. I have on my news feed sort of studies that have, research breakthroughs that have coming out of labs and universities. They're mind-blowing. Now, does 1 in 100 scale up? I get all that. I've been studying this for 3 decades. But we should be investing way more in that. And then, the notion that somehow DOE is working to get to P3, I don't really buy that. We proposed about 8 years ago this idea that the rich countries should commit to doubling their clean energy R&D. A couple of years later, that was adopted at the COP agreement, and they came up with a thing called mission innovation. We wrote a report a few years after that. We called it omission innovation. 1 country met their goal. There were countries that actually reduced their R&D spend on clean energy over that period of time. And these were countries who were hectoring the rest of us about all the great things they were doing, like Denmark. And yet their government was cutting R&D. If we were serious about P3, every government in the world would double their clean energy R&D within 5 years. That would tell me we're serious about P3. We're not serious about it because they're not doing it. Last point would be somebody, I think, Sam, you mentioned Sunshot, which was an ARPA-E program. That's getting to P3. I mean, I don't care if it fails. It doesn't matter to me whether it fails. The issue is, was it designed the best they could design it, the best chance of success?
I think there's a difference between announcing a P3 target and having a credible plan to get to it. I just think that, the hydrogen plan is a serious plan. Oh, sorry.
You're on.
The hydrogen plan is a serious plan. They're trying, but announcing an extremely ambitious target is not in itself a solution. I mean, you have to do the work to do the rest. So
Yeah, I think that is the key, is what this report, as I tried to say, is this report offers a lot of broad generalities to help us kind of understand the themes and start talking about it. But the value of the report is all in the specific sectoral analyses and technology-specific analyses that you mostly haven't done, but which you are asking us to do. And that's very difficult. And when you talk about it at a broader level, it's just very easy to start raising objections. So you say you're all for Vogel. And in fact, we should be doing more Vogels. We should be, right? We should be developing all these technologies.
But generically, yes.
Generically. But Robin's also complaining about the kitchen sink approach, right? Where we're just throwing money at everything.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, if you don't actually know which technologies are going to get to P3, and you can't predict that with a great deal of reliability because it's just really difficult, you can make a judgment.
I think
that you need a kind of humble portfolio of some sort, which others could call the kitchen sink.
I don't agree, because I think we need to differentiate between where on the TRL scale you are. And now there's a view that this stuff is so good, we should be at TRL 6, 7, 8, putting a boatload. And as you go up the TRL level, technology readiness level, you have to put more and more money in at each stage. I think the biggest conclusion of the report is that's a mistake. We should be spending more on earlier TRLs with less money per thing, because just discovery is the reason. One of the mistakes the climate community makes, in my view, is they say this is so important. If we don't solve it now, we can't wait for R&D breakthroughs. Right. Well, yeah, I wish they could come sooner. If we funded them, we could, but that's just the reality. So I do think it's more than just look at these TRL 8s and analyze them more. It's move the whole portfolio into higher risk, higher return, lots of different bets. You have no clue which ones are going to make it.
Yeah. Hey, Rob, can I jump in for a minute? I think that this is a really interesting tension that's just come out in the last few minutes. And I think it goes to Sam's point about uncertainty. If we all had platonic guardians, in government who could magically anticipate, the relative success or probabilities of different technologies moving forward, we'd be in nirvana, right? Because then we'd have a perfect system that was allocating everything properly. This is messy. I think Sam made the point. and new information comes in all the time. And some of this is not about core technologies, even. Let's just take the nuclear example for a second. So, the Gen 3 Plus is at TRL, complete, right? I mean, we built these plants. The question, the issue that Vodal poses, in my opinion, is not about fundamental technology innovation. It's about what is the right policy in terms of deployment and running things down the cost curve. So it's more about TRL 11, 12, and 13, which is what is the right policy to get these things into large uptake. And the DOE, to its credit, came out with a report a few weeks ago saying, the real issue for a Vodal is not that we got to the first two, it's how do we get to the 10th or the 12th or the 15th, by which time we would expect costs to come down. And in fact, we have proof of concept of that. The United Emirates built 4 of the same unit essentially, and they found rapid declining costs as they built each unit. So that's a very nuanced sort of policy. And I think that is the notion of focusing on a specific deployment pathway. What the DOE report recommends is that, it's really not about fundamental innovation in nuclear anymore. It's about driving down the cost curve. And the key to driving down the cost curve is getting a large order book. So we're not building one of the first of kind and then last of kind because it was too expensive and then we give up. So I think the challenge moving from P3, by the way, Rob, I think, you're to be commended, and Sam and others who've worked on this for years, the fact that P3 is at least nominally paid, obedience to. I mean, it has become part of the discussion, even if it's in practice not always honored, is itself a big deal. I think we should recognize that it took 10 or 15 years to kind of get this idea instantiated in the policy dialogue. But the next question that I think Sam is raising is, how do you turn the dials under conditions of uncertainty and also of political economy where some lobbies are just going to entrench, and it's very hard to take a subsidy away and say, actually, we've proven our case. Now it's to the market to decide. Or something that looks kind of unpromising really does need a nudge. It's going to be very hard to get a lot of people excited about more nuclear build after the Vodal 2x cost overrun, right? So that I think that granularity and the ability of the system to actually think at the level of detail and specificity that is required, I think, is like the institutional competence challenge that maybe Sam is addressing, and maybe that's something that a future ITIF report can focus on.
And I agree with all of that very much, but just to add in just one more level of complexity to all of this, you also have to appreciate that all of these technologies are not, the question is not just P3 within its own technology family, but at the same time, there's innovation going on in lots of other technology families that provide the same resources. So it's great that we're making a lot of progress in advanced nuclear, but we also had a big announcement this week about progress in geothermal, right? So geothermal could make nuclear not P3 if it turns out to be really cheap, right? So
I honestly think.
no, I'm not. I'm just.
No, I know.
I'm not making a prediction. I'm just saying these predictions are all very different.
I think that
Very
you're adding complexity to this, really, because we're going to need to place lots and lots of bets.
Yeah.
Some will work, some won't. Maybe geothermal, which is a great technology potentially, in some parts of the country will be there, nuclear in other parts.
Right.
I think the main point, though, and Armand, I get the whole institutional thing. I write about that all the time when it comes to the, I think, inability or less ability of the federal government to adopt a competitiveness-based industrial policy. They don't have the analytical or institutional capabilities, in my view, to do that well.
And that would be easier, and I would think more bipartisan than this. And they can't even do that.
Right, but the fact that the entire ship is heading in this direction versus going in that direction, if we just alter the course of the ship 30 degrees, the likelihood of getting better decisions goes up. I've been talking too much. Let's see other comments or questions from the audience or from online. Wait for the mic, please.
Hi, I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consulting engineer, and I salute you. A great report. I think you have the right idea here. I think one of the things that has been not emphasized enough is the R&D having its own characteristics, and every technology must be examined in detail for the engineering of whether it works all right, and also for the geography, that some things like solar work fine where it's bright and sunshiny, but it's not going to work up in Alaska. So I think these details of the technology and looking at each one in detail and letting it run its course to get the data is what's really needed here.
Great, thank you.
We have a question from the audience. Nuclear is already cheaper than fossil fuels at scale, but it hasn't taken off. Are there limits to the price parity model?
As far as I know, nuclear is not at price parity, period. I mean, I don't think it's even close to price parity. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong. Armin and I could share the role as nuclear boosters on this panel. I think we're both very enthusiastic about nuclear, and
Me
yeah,
too.
okay. So we're all enthusiastic. I believe that by the end of this decade, some of the advanced reactor companies that are on paper today will have built first of a kind reactors and proven what the price points are for them, and nuclear will start taking off. But we're still at the point where that's, on the near term horizon. I've just been talking about Vogtle as being perhaps the most expensive new power generation we've ever built in this country.
Just with the size.
Yeah, so right. So no, nuclear is not simply at P3. Can nuclear get there? Yeah, maybe. I hope so. And I think, again, this illustrates exactly the value of this framework, but the challenge in applying it. It is very difficult. Not to say that that's not a reason to try. Let's turn the ship those 30 degrees.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess thinking about this, the importance of the P3 framework is what does it challenge? What does it replace? It replaces a framework that says this technology will reduce carbon, and so we should support it. That this technology could put a significant dent in our emissions, and so we should mandate EVs, for example. This is two fundamental problems. It's not our emissions that matter, and it really will only work globally if we can invoke the market.
I mean, I would actually say the situation is even worse than that, Robin, because a lot of the time we're not even asking whether policies reduce American emissions. Actually, we have a problem with clean energy cannibalization in this country,
Yes.
where, wind and solar is making the economics of nuclear unfavorable. That's a problem. And that, again, speaks to why I think we actually do need a plan of some sort, a forcing umbrella.
Well, exactly.
And Armin and I could argue all day about whether 111D is the right umbrella or not. I don't think all forcing umbrellas are necessarily helpful, but I do think you need something to guide the transition.
Well, I think that speaks to the systems approach. If we go all in on hydrogen, on green hydrogen,
Right.
It's going to suck up all the green energy in the country. I mean, it takes a lot of green energy to run a green hydrogen plant. If you don't insist that more green energy gets built to serve it,
I agree.
You're just cannibalized.
I have a question here.
Paul Saunders with the Energy Innovation Reform Project. I certainly, like others, commend the report and the effort. And Rob, if I understand your argument, I think very much in support of what you're suggesting. I'll try to reframe it in a somewhat different way. If we can kill one idea that's a bad idea, that where the curve will never get there, we can pay to start 200 new curves, and see which of those work out. And to me, that sounds like the real value here. And, Sam, I very much take your point about the uncertainty, and it's hard to tell, but I think it also kind of depends how you think about it. It's very hard to figure out which technologies are on the pathway to get there. It's much easier to determine which ones are not, in my view. So then to me, the task becomes, finding 1, 2, or 3 of these things to get rid of, so that we can focus on what's really important. And from an operational perspective, trying to figure out the politics and the political economy of how to do that. And I would kind of welcome your reaction on the panel to that line of thinking.
So I think if we had call me naive, only been in Washington 38 years.
And you're still
I-
naive?
Huh?
And you're still naive?
Cynically.
Cynically naive. Okay, very good.
No, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic. I have faith. Imagine if we'd had this framework in place when the drafters of the IRA were drafting. And instead of nobody knows what the amount of IRA will be, but let's just say for the sake of argument, $600 billion. Imagine if we'd said, you know what? We're going to have an insurance policy here. We're going to take 50 billion of that and we're going to fund 200 new cost curves. I think we would be in a very different situation than we are today. And the reason we didn't do that is very simple, because the goal was to decarbonize America with existing technology and subsidize the heck out of it. Now, there is no question that some of that will move these technologies. Some of that will move some of these technologies to P3, but not all of it will. So in some ways, that's sort of the simple thing. It's like we should have made more bets and get 100 potential cost curves to be supported at much less money. And that's where, to me, university research should play a much bigger role. Creativity, maybe we need an SBIR for energy, these sorts of things. Because we have all this entrepreneurial talent and creativity, and yet we're just thinking about this as let's deploy 5 more of those. So that would be my.
Rob, I think there's let's not forget the IIJA, which did have more of that sort of early stage demonstration kind of focus. So I always think about IIJA and IRA, as flawed as we might argue either of them are, as a companion set of policies. Again, I think we can argue about the details of each of those, but I think there was at least a general recognition that the needs for early TRL are different than later TRL. And so I guess, again, it comes back to the question of, who decides, what is the mechanism by which we're constantly getting real world feedback? Paul, to your point, when do we decide to shut the spigot off and say this just isn't going anywhere? Those are hard things to do once you've created a constituency around particular technologies. So these are non-trivial institutional problems, but frankly, other countries have figured this out and have made a lot of success, not just in the energy space, but aerospace, dare I say, defense. I heard a wonderful quip the other day from someone who said, the only one who really knows how to do innovation is our defense departments, because they're the only ones who really know how to waste money. And I mean, I think it was meant tongue in cheek, but the idea was that because, at least at the early stage, there will be failures. There'll be lots of them. And you do have to spread your bets, and 90% of them will disappear. But that's a hard political case to make sometimes.
Could I just jump in
One more
with just
question?
one word before?
Sure.
I do think a word that appears in this report a number of times, but I don't think we've talked about much here today, is trade-offs. And I do think that fundamentally this report assumes that we can, as a country and as a political system, make rational decisions about trade-offs.
We were never that ambitious.
Okay. I do think that actually, in fact, we would be a much better country. We would do much better with all these things if we were thinking about how to spend the next incremental dollar most cost effectively. And I just don't think we even begin to try that in government today. It's, It's not a zero-sum game. It's the government checkbook is open to us in any way we can tap into it, in the dark of night when the bill is being written, and more money for X doesn't mean less money for Y, So I applaud the desire for trade-off based thinking. I just think it's
No,
you're crying.
I've been here 38 years, whatever, and I never assume trade. They're not going to do that. They're never going to do that in a million years. They're just all we're going to say is do more of this. And if we can get them to say, hey, you know what? I don't need them to do a cost benefit. All we need them to do is think that the White House report that said we have all the technology we need to solve climate is wrong, that just building up solutions in the US may not get us there, and we need to make a lot more big bets or small bets for more transformers. That's all.
I think that is trade-offs, more big bets, but we don't need to quibble about it. I think it speaks to Paul's point anyways, of zero out one, fund 200. I'm for it. It's just, I don't know if that's how we do things. Sorry,
So-
questions from the audience. Time is running short. I
Time for
apologize.
one last question from the online audience. So
Yes, this question is online from Carl Husker at the World Resources
Carl.
Institute. Carl says, the current economics of nuclear varies widely across countries and, quote, who is building it? 15 of the G20 countries are expanding nuclear. IPCC AR6 supports role for nuclear, but sadly, the summary for policymakers erased virtually all references to nuclear. What are your thoughts?
I think I've already expressed my opinions on this, that nuclear is not P3 today, but it has as good a chance in my mind as any of getting there. And I think Carl's point about the costs varying depending on where they're built, is an important one. It shows that what is P3 and whether technology has achieved it isn't just a straightforward cut and dried exercise. It involves a lot of variables. And I wouldn't suggest that you.
Let me say something about this is a useful way to think about the difficulties of doing P3 analysis.
Yeah.
So, all right. So there are those in the nuclear community who believe that small modular reactors can be created at least at a sort of batch production level, and maybe we'll get to mass production for some of the components. Fine. And that we will come down the cost curve. So I think, and it's going to take time. We all understand that. So it seems to me that we need to take, as Armin said earlier, a time-based approach to this and say, okay, well, if small modular reactors are in fact on the path to P3, this is the path that they will have to follow. And 8 years from now, in 2031, we need to see this kind of progress. And if we're not seeing that kind of progress, then we need to maybe rethink about whether they're really on the path. And we should be very reluctant to allow that path to allow the industry to say, well, actually the path is gonna get us there in 2040, right? I mean, there are certain technologies that are always 10 years away, and you do not want to get into funding technologies that are always 10 years away. So maybe one solution to the difficulties is to say to the industry, well, tell us the pathway. We'll help you to get onto that pathway. Tell us about the milestones along the pathway. And if you're really radically out by the time you hit your first milestone, well, sorry, guys, you're out of luck.
So I think we need to wrap up. But one comment I would make to that, one question or comment would be, this goes to the other major point of the climate change movement, which we hit very hard, is virtually, I don't know, you can argue how much, let's just say 70% of the climate change movement or 50% is built around the notion. I mean, first of all, 50% of the environmental movement hates nuclear. I don't know, maybe it's more. And they think we can have solutions like the 15-minute city. If you think about that just for like a moment, you can realize why that will never work, because we've built out our cities over the last 150 years. They think we can get to the 15-minute city. They think we can get solar panels on our roof and have distributed energy without big utility. They think we don't need nuclear. They think we shouldn't drive. And if we just took 10% of that energy and had all these groups say, you know what, forget that. It is meaningless. It won't solve anything. It's a drop in the bucket. First of all, it's not going to happen. I remember my favorite was the Sierra Club one year proposing that to save energy and save the climate, we shouldn't buy wrapping paper. We should use paper bags that we have at the store and then use them for our gifts. Well, I know I did that year. And I know you all will do that this year. And I know that will save enormous amounts of carbon emissions. So rather than focus on that, if we just had those groups spend 10% of their political energy on beefing up the ARPA-E budget, we would be a lot better off. And I think that's another major point here, is it's this view that we should wear the hair shirt and that is going to have any effect whatsoever. All right, I think with that, Armand, thank you so much for joining us remotely. Sam, thank you. Very helpful comments. Appreciate everybody in the room, and I appreciate everybody who joined online. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin.